Okay, we are at the end of the rise of industrialism and the progressive era in the United States. Now, in this video, I will discuss President Woodrow Wilson and his place in the progressive era. The mission statement of the University of Virginia Miller Center states they are inspiring American leaders with nonpartisan insight, especially on the presidency, that advances democratic institution and public good. Now, this think tank describes Woodrow Wilson as one of America's greatest presidents. His domestic program expanded the role of the federal government in managing the economy and protecting the interests of American citizens. His foreign policy established a new vision of America's role in the world, and he helped to make the White House the center of power in Washington. Now, most historians are going to rank him among the 5 most important American presidents, along with Washington, Lincoln, the 2 Roosevelts. Now wait, not so fast. Today we're going to look at the 28th President of the United States and see if he was the greatest progressive leader of all times. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in Staunton, Virginia, December 28, 1856. He was the 3rd of 4 children, and he was born to Joseph Ruggles Wilson and Jessie Wilson. Now, Wilson's father was a Presbyterian pastor who settled the family in Augusta, Georgia. In 1858, Wilson claims one of his earliest memories was of hearing the news that Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He was around 4 years old at that time. That's plausible. Wilson's career was geared towards academia with an emphasis on law and government and history. He graduated from the College of New Jersey, known today as Princeton University, graduating in 1878 with a Bachelor's of Art degree. He then enrolled in the University of Virginia Law School. He passed the Georgia Bar exam in 1882 and went into private practice. But he dissolved his practice after a year, finding the day-to-day routine just a drudgery and unfulfilling. Now, it's at this point that Wilson enrolled in the PhD program at Johns Hopkins University. In 1886, Wilson was awarded his PhD in History and Government from Johns Hopkins. Now, in his book, Wilson, A. Scott Berg quotes Wilson's writing, "A professorship was the only feasible place for me, the only place that would afford leisure for reading and for original work, the only strictly literary berth with an income attached." Now, Wilson was an academic. He was not a political animal. While he was working towards his PhD, Wilson wrote Congressional Government. Now, this was a study in American politics. Wilson did not enter the political arena like most politicians at that time. He studied politics, wrote books on politics, and taught political theory as a college professor. Wilson's academic star was on the rise when he joined the faculty at Princeton University. Now, as the chair of jurisprudence and political economy, he was popular and respected by his students. Now, in 1902, Wilson was appointed president of Princeton University. Under this administration, or his administration, he revamped the academic standards, turning Princeton into a first-class Ivy League school. Now, however, not all of his changes were heartily endorsed. You see, Wilson ran afoul of the alumni when he proposed to break the hold the social elite had. You see, the upperclassmen at Princeton had what were called eating clubs. Now, Wilson wanted to disband the eating clubs, just establishing individual colleges within Princeton University and college dormitory systems. Now, these progressive changes brought Wilson into conflict with Princeton's University's Board of Trustees. Now, these progressive changes brought Wilson into direct conflict with the Princeton University Boards of Trustees. Another thing he did was he was determined to keep African Americans out of his university. Wilson's success at transforming Princeton from a place for the sons of the social elite to spend 4 pleasant years perfecting their social skills and networking into a rigorous academic institution brought him national attention and name recognition. Now, he was becoming disenchanted with the political infighting at Princeton. Wilson let it be known in the right political circles that he was interested in political office. Now, Wilson's popularity with the people brought the Democratic state bosses calling. Now, the Democratic machine of New Jersey put Wilson into the governor's office. He immediately started to push his reform agenda, and then by the end of the first term, Wilson had successfully signed into law bills that restricted labor by women and children, improved standards for factory workers, created a state board of education with the power to conduct inspections and enforce standards, regulate district borrowing authority, and required special classes for students with handicaps. He established free dental clinics. Nurses training was standardized. He enacted prison reform and compelled all railroad companies to pay their employees twice monthly. He regulated working hours, health and safety, employment, and the age of people employed in the mercantile business. He reformed the jury system and introduced state antitrust laws. But the two major reforms he did not even try to enact were civil rights for African Americans and women's rights to vote. Now, with the split in the Republican Party for the 1912 presidential election, Wilson saw his opportunity to win the presidency. Now, the National Democratic Convention was a political brawl that would see Wilson having to make backroom deals with the Democratic elite to gain the nomination. By the 45th ballot, Wilson had secured the two-thirds votes needed from the delegates to become the Democratic nominee for president. Now, the platform candidate Wilson campaigned on was for limits on corporate campaign contributions, tariff reductions, new and stronger antitrust laws, banking and currency reform, a federal income tax, direct election of senators, a single-term presidency, and the independence of the Philippines. Wilson called his agenda the New Freedoms. Because of the split in the Republican Party, though, Wilson won that election with 82% of the electoral vote, but only 42% of the popular vote. Now, just over a month after his inauguration, Wilson convened a special joint session of Congress to announce his administration's agenda. This centered on expanding economic opportunities for people at the bottom of society and eliminating special privileges for the richest and most powerful citizens. Now, this does sound familiar with the current occupant of the White House, build up from the bottom up and the middle out. Anyways, okay, with the reduction of tariffs, the federal government would see a corresponding loss of revenue, though. Wilson was able to offset this loss by using the 16th Amendment, income tax. Just before Wilson's inauguration, the 16th Amendment had been ratified. He argued that the high tariffs created monopolies and hurt consumers, and his lower tariffs were especially popular with the majority of the people in the South and West. The act offset lost revenue by providing for a small graduated income tax as authorized by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which had been adopted on February 25, 1913, before Wilson took office. Now, the National Archives webpage, Milestone Documents, stated that when the act was enacted, due to generous exemptions and deductions, less than 1% of the population paid income tax at the rate of only 1% of net income. Now, okay, I might be a little subjective here, but as a people, we have to seriously look at who we are electing to represent us. The conservative members of Congress actually proposed the 16th Amendment because they believed the states would never ratify it and put the whole income tax idea to bed. But the people did ratify it because they believed it would only be a small 1% tax on 1% of the population. Gee, what were the people thinking? The way the amendment was written, the federal government could tax as much as they wanted. Amendment 16, excuse me. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Today, in 2024, the top tax rate is 37% for an individual earning over $609,350 a year, which is still 1% of the population. However, the Institution for Taxation and Economic Policy states that 59.9% of all U.S. households pay federal income tax. Granted, it's a graduated income tax, and ever since 1913, the federal government has been lowering the income tax level that can be taxed. That is something to think about the next time you hear politicians say tax the rich. What they are really saying is the working class and the middle class are going to shoulder the tax burden. Okay, I've digressed. I'm letting my subjectivity creep into the subject. I'm sorry. Anyways, back to Wilson and the reform movement. Now, Wilson was successful in passing his tariff reform with the Smith-Underwood Act. This act reduced tariffs considerably and allowed the federal government to institute a personal income tax. This is one reason why I don't think Wilson was a great president. He set in motion what would become one of the most oppressive bureaucratic agencies of the federal government. That's called the IRS, where you are considered guilty until you can prove you're innocent. Okay, Wilson's next major reform had to do with banking and currency. By the early 20th century, bankers and businessmen had also begun to demand reform. After the Panic of 1907, the Pujo Committee, this was a special congressional investigating committee, found that a handful of banks and corporations controlled the nation's wealth. Reformers wanted a strong federal system that would regulate credit and oversee the nation's currency. Now, in response to the demand for reform, Wilson was successful in getting Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This established 12 regional reserve banks controlled by the Federal Reserve Board, and its members were appointed by the President. Now, this federal system could adjust interest rates and the nation's money supply because it was authorized to issue currency based on government securities and commercial paper, the loans made to the businesses by the banks. Now, the amount of money in circulation would expand or contract with the business cycle. The Federal Reserve has the authority to adjust interest rates or discount rates charged to its member banks for the money deposited in the branch reserve banks, which would indirectly control the interest rates that banks charge their borrowers. Now, the Fed can also set the amount of money banks have to hold as an offset against deposits, thereby creating a reserve fund during times of economic crisis. This act is considered the most important domestic achievement of the Wilson administration by historians, and the Federal Reserve is still in effect today. Now, Wilson continued with his efforts to use the federal government to curb business trusts. In 1914, he supported the Clayton Antitrust Act. This act prohibited anti-competitive business practice such as price fixing or having the same person sitting on the executive boards of competing companies in one industry. Now, the Clayton Act also helped to empower the Federal Trade Commission, which created a new governing board appointed by the President. Now, this board was empowered to investigate and publicize corrupt, unfair, or anti-competitive business practices. Wilson appointed Louis Brandeis, a dedicated progressive who, among other things, fought against the exploitation of women and children workers, to the Supreme Court, a very brilliant Associate Justice. Now, he signed into law the Adamson Act, mandated an 8-hour workday for railroad employees. This act paved the way to shorten workdays for all industrial workers. So far, Wilson should be considered a great reformer. He was enacting the new freedom platform of social justice and opportunity for all Americans. But something happened on his way to political sainthood. You see, Wilson was a racist. He was a Southerner who took a paternal attitude towards the African Americans. The University of Virginia Miller Center's webpage states Wilson ordered resegregation of the federal bureaucracy was based on his cabinet advice. President Wilson allowed members of his cabinet to introduce segregation or reintroduce segregation in the federal departments such as the Post Office and the Treasury Department. He claimed that segregation reduced friction between blacks and whites while working together. Then we have the infamous movie night at the White House. The February 18, 1915 edition of the Washington Times stated that President Wilson will be the first president to have a private showing of a moving picture in the White House, which was arranged by his daughters. So what was this movie? It was D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. It was a private viewing for just the president, his family, and a few friends, including the author Tom Frederick Dixon Jr., who wrote the book The Klansman, which Birth of a Nation was based on, and the director D.W. Griffith. The 3.5-hour silent movie was screened in the East Room of the White House. When asked about the movie, Wilson allegedly remarked, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is all so terribly true." There is debate whether or not Wilson said that. Now, Birth of a Nation is universally considered today nothing more than racist propaganda. 1915, it was considered popular by a large portion of white society. What is no doubt is the reaction from the African American public. Washington Times, April 30th, 1915 edition stated, Leading color men of the country have bitterly represented its production, claiming that it was defamatory of the race and the reduction of the colored race to a state in which full rights of citizenship are denied. Massachusetts Congressman Thatcher wrote a scathing letter to President Wilson denouncing the picture screening in the White House. The public uproar became so intense that Wilson had his secretary, Joseph Timothy, publicly announce that President Wilson was entirely unaware of the character of the play before it was presented, and at no time expressed his approbation of it. Approbation is what my dad would call a 50-cent word. It means approval. Now, there's a slight problem with Wilson's denial. In his book, History of the American People, Wilson wrote, "The white man was aroused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country." Now, Wilson was a racist. It wasn't his cabinet. It was Wilson who resegregated the federal government. Then D.W. Griffith used a number of quotes from Wilson's book in the movie. A complete semester course could be taught on President Wilson and his racist attitude and the attitude of the American public at that time. What is unmistakable, though, about Wilson is he failed as a reformer on civil rights. Now, the other area where he had failed was women's rights. The leading suffragette at this time was Alice Paul. Her activism for women's rights was legendary. Her protests sent her to jail on many occasions. Her hunger strikes while in jail became national news. Paul and her companions tried to meet with President Wilson numerous times to advocate for the 19th Amendment. That's the right for women to vote. Wilson was not a supporter of the suffragette movement. He took a paternal attitude towards women. He believed in the inferiority of women. Now, it wasn't until World War I and the role that women played in winning the war that Wilson grudgingly, and I mean grudgingly, supported the 19th Amendment. It was political expediency that changed Wilson's mind on the suffragette movement. In his address to Congress on September 30th, 1918, Wilson stated, "The American women are too noble and too intelligent and too devoted to be slackers, whether you give or withhold this thing that is mere justice. But I know the magic. It will, in their thoughts and spirits, if you give it to them. I propose it as I would propose to admit soldiers to the suffrage, men fighting in the field for our liberties and the liberties of the world. Were they excluded? The task of the women lie at the very heart of the war, and I know how much stronger that heart will beat if you do this thing and show our women that you trust them as much as you, in fact and of necessity, depend on them." It is my opinion that Wilson was more concerned with the midterm elections and the loss of a democratically controlled Congress than he was about women's voting. Now, if you would like to learn more about Alice Paul and women's voting rights, I made a video about the Silent Sentinels. Now, the link will be in the description below. Now, as far as a political reformer, I would not give Wilson high marks. Yes, he did reduce tariffs, which helped the American public, but he stuck the American people with an income tax which has continually enlarged ever since. Yes, he did support direct elections of U.S. senators, but that would probably eventually happen whether a Democrat or Republican was president. Now, I will give him props for instituting the Federal Reserve banking system, which did have a positive effect on the economy, as long as we overlook that small matter of the stock market crash in the Great Depression 8 years later. Now, the reason why I believe he was a failure as a reformer was his position on civil rights and women's suffrage. The former, he believed, could be safely ignored due to the attitude of the majority of the electorate. The latter was political expediency. The right for women to vote had come. Wilson wanted to be on the right side of the electorate and history. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there who disagree with my position on President Wilson. Now, that's fine. You know, debate and discussion. That's how we learn from each other and how we grow as people. Now, in the next series of videos in U.S. history for high school will be on the United States becoming a world power, also described as American imperialism. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, if you did, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment or a question about the content below. Most importantly, please share this video with your friends. Remember, the easiest way to earn an A, just show up for class and pay attention. Okay, guys. Thank you for watching.